The unthinkable has just happened in Westminster, in a move that has shattered every expectation and rewritten the political script of Britain. The Speaker of the House of Commons stood, broke centuries of protocol and delivered a declaration no one believed they would ever hear. Nigel Farage, the man dismissed for years as an outsider, a disruptor, a political insurgent with no chance of power, has now been named the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Across the chamber, Keir Starmer sat frozen, stripped of authority, his carefully built image collapsing in front of millions watching live. This was not a quiet shift. It was a political earthquake, a moment that ripped through the foundations of Labour and the Conservatives alike, leaving nothing untouched. Shockwaves spread instantly across the nation, phones buzzed, headlines screamed, social media ignited, and every household in Britain felt the weight of history pressing down. The impossible had just become reality. From the very beginning of the day, there had been no hint that such a dramatic upheaval was about to unfold. Westminster was preparing for yet another ordinary session. The ritual arguments, the polished speeches, the endless rehearsals of party lines that had numbed the public into apathy. But when Nigel Farage stepped into the chamber, everything changed. His presence cut through the stale air like a blade. There was no bluster, no theatrics, no empty gestures. He carried with him something far more dangerous, calm conviction. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Members who usually sneered or smirked at his appearances straightened in their seats, drawn instinctively to the intensity radiating from him. Something in the chamber warned them that what they were about to witness would not be routine. It would be history. When Farage rose to speak, silence gripped the Commons. His voice was not raised in fury, nor wrapped in polite tradition. It was sharp, deliberate, and precise. Each word carried the weight of years of frustration, years of betrayal felt by ordinary people outside Westminster's guild halls. He did not aim his message at the MPs in front of him alone. He aimed it at the millions watching across the nation, the voters long abandoned, the families struggling with rising costs, the workers left behind by parties too consumed with power games to care about their struggles. He spoke not as a career politician, but as a reckoning. His words were knives cutting through the illusions of leadership that Labour and the Conservatives had clung to for decades. Keir Starmer, the man once celebrated for his composure and careful strategies, found himself suddenly exposed. As Farage accused him of broken promises, economic mismanagement and betrayal of the very citizens Labour claimed to champion, the mask of calm began to slip. Starmer's lips moved, but no conviction followed. His replies landed hollow, his voice trembling under the weight of an attack he had not prepared for. The nation watched as the man presented as steady and disciplined collapsed before their eyes. Every strike landed by Farage was devastating, not because it was loud, but because it was true. The Labour front bench, once confident, now looked pale and shaken. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, faced her own moment of humiliation as Farage turned his fire toward her, dismantling her record with merciless clarity. "You are out of your depth," he said coldly, "and the British people are paying the price." The chamber fell silent. Reeves sat motionless, her credibility gone in an instant. But Farage's fury was not reserved for Labour alone. With a sharp turn, he turned his attention to the Conservatives. The party that had once held the keys to power for decades, now clinging to what remained of its reputation. His words tore through their facade of control. "You let this country rot," he declared, his tone calm yet merciless, laying bare the arrogance, the hollow promises, and the failed leadership that had driven Britain into stagnation. The reaction was immediate. Uneasy laughter rippled across the chamber, but it was laughter laced with fear. Fear that the old order was no longer safe, that every false promise, every betrayal was finally being dragged into the light. For the first time in living memory, both major parties, Labour and Conservative, sat powerless, stripped of the illusion of authority. Farage's presence consumed the chamber. He did not shout, he did not gloat. He wielded silence as a weapon. Every pause in his speech, every deliberate glance carried more weight than years of empty debate. It was not just a political speech, it was a funeral. the burial of credibility, the execution of an old system that had failed the nation. MPs who had thought themselves untouchable were reduced to shadows of themselves, whispering in panic, their world collapsing around them. And then the moment came. The moment that no one had predicted, no journalist had whispered about, no pundit had dared imagine. The Speaker of the House of Commons, known for neutrality, known for caution, rose to his feet. The chamber froze. Centuries of protocol dictated that the Speaker remain silent, impartial, untouched by the chaos of debate. But today was different. His voice, steady yet filled with urgency, cut through the stunned silence. In words that shattered tradition and defied every expectation, he declared what no one thought possible. Nigel Farage was, in essence, now the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The chamber erupted into chaos. Gasps, shouts, disbelief filled the air as MPs struggled to comprehend what had just been said. Keir Starmer sat motionless, pale, trembling, unable to grasp how everything he had built could collapse in a single afternoon. The Conservatives looked on in silence, stripped of their usual arrogance, left with nothing but fear of what was to come. Across the country, millions sat glued to their screens, jaws dropped as the reality set in. Farage had done the impossible. The outsider had seized the crown. The old political order was in ruins. Farage himself did not gloat. He stood calm, still, his presence alone carrying more power than any celebration could. The silence around him was deafening, a silence that confirmed what everyone already knew. The storm had passed and Britain would never be the same again. As the declaration of the Speaker reverberated across Westminster, the chamber itself seemed to fall into a stunned paralysis. Centuries of tradition had just been torn apart in front of the world, and no one knew how to react. Some MPs shouted in disbelief, others whispered frantically to their aides, while many simply sat frozen, their eyes darting between Starmer's pale, broken face and Farage's unshaken stance. The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy, suffocating, charged with the realisation that a political earthquake had just shattered the very ground beneath their feet. The old rules of power were gone. The carefully scripted dramas of Parliament had been burned away in an instant, replaced by raw, unfiltered authority. Keir Starmer, once the picture of control, now resembled a man stripped bare, trembling, hollow-eyed, as though the weight of his collapse had drained the very strength from his body. Those around him tried to offer reassurance, whispering desperate words, but he could not hear them. His reputation, his strategy, his years of careful positioning, all of it had crumbled like ash before the force of Farage's onslaught. Across the Labour benches, panic spread like wildfire. Seasoned MPs who had survived decades of infighting and scandal looked as though they were witnessing something they could not comprehend. Some avoided eye contact, their heads bowed in shame, while others turned toward Farage, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and reluctant recognition. Even those who had mocked him, dismissed him as a fringe figure, now sat in uneasy silence, unable to deny the presence that dominated the chamber. Rachel Reeves, her hands gripping the desk before her, remained motionless, still haunted by Farage's words that had dismantled her credibility in seconds. Every flicker of movement, every attempt at whispered coordination among Labour's front bench collapsed under the realisation that their authority had been stripped away in full view of the nation. But it was not only Labour that felt the crushing weight of this moment. The Conservatives, long accustomed to playing the role of the steady opposition, sat stunned. For years, they had treated Farage as a nuisance, a man who could stir anger but never command power. Yet here he stood, unflinching, the centre of Britain's political universe. His words had not only shattered Labour, they had torn apart the facade of Tory competence as well. "You let this country rot," he had said, and the words hung in the air like a verdict that no one dared to challenge. Conservative MPs shifted uneasily in their seats, some whispering among themselves, others staring blankly ahead, knowing that their party too had been dragged into the wreckage. What once felt like a rivalry between Labour and Conservative now seemed like a shared collapse. Farage had done what no one else had managed. He had dismantled both pillars of the establishment in a single afternoon. Meanwhile, beyond the chamber walls, the outside world was already on fire. Newsrooms across Britain scrambled to rewrite their headlines, anchors interrupted their broadcasts mid-sentence, and social media erupted into chaos. Clips of Farage's precision strikes and Starmer's trembling collapse flooded every platform, shared millions of times within minutes. Hashtags surged across the globe. Viewers sat in disbelief, replaying the moment the speaker had spoken, their voices rising in cafes, offices, buses, and living rooms across the nation. The narrative was no longer controlled by politicians or pundits. It was now in the hands of the people, and the people were united in one truth. The old order had fallen. For some, it was a moment of shock and grief. For others, it was a moment of exhilaration, the long-awaited collapse of a political class that had betrayed them for decades. In the chamber, Farage remained still, allowing the chaos to swirl around him. He did not speak further. He did not need to. Every eye remained locked on him. Every whisper carried his name. He had turned silence into dominance, and in doing so, proved that true authority does not need theatrics. It demands recognition. His calmness contrasted so sharply with the panic around him that it only reinforced the perception that he had already stepped into the role of Prime Minister. The MPs knew it, the Speaker had confirmed it, the people watching believed it, and Keir Starmer, still slumped in disbelief, felt it in the deepest part of his being. His career, his party, and his claim to leadership had been annihilated before the entire world. Outside, protesters gathered at the gates of Parliament, some cheering, others shouting in outrage. Police struggled to contain the swelling crowds as chants filled the air. Britain itself seemed to pulse with tension, every citizen aware that they were living through a moment that would be remembered for generations. The headlines declared it: Farage rises, Starmer falls. The shock was not limited to the UK alone. International observers, from Washington to Brussels, watched in disbelief as the United Kingdom, long seen as a bastion of predictable politics, plunged into a moment of seismic change. Diplomats scrambled, analysts speculated, and world leaders demanded updates, all asking the same question: what happens next? Inside Parliament, that very question haunted every MP, every aide, every trembling official. What happens now? The Speaker's declaration had broken the chains of protocol, thrusting Farage into a position of undeniable power. Yet there was no handbook, no precedent, no clear path forward. All that remained was uncertainty, fear, and the undeniable fact that one man had achieved the impossible. Nigel Farage had crossed the threshold. He was no longer a rebel at the gates of power. He was inside, standing at the heart of Westminster, unshaken, unchallenged, and unstoppable. As the chamber struggled to recover from the shock, the cracks in Britain's political establishment widened into full collapse. Keir Starmer, pale and trembling, sat slumped in his seat, his aides hovering uselessly, whispering frantic reassurances that sounded hollow, even to their own ears. He had built his career on the image of calm order and composure, and now all of it had been ripped away in the space of a single afternoon. His reputation lay in ruins, his authority dismantled in real time before the eyes of the nation. The man who had promised to restore trust and stability in British politics was now a broken figure, his voice silenced, his body language screaming defeat. The Labour Party, once united under his careful discipline, had been left disoriented, its front bench visibly shaken. MPs who had once stood firm behind him now stared at the floor, avoiding the gaze of the cameras, their silence louder than any words. But it was not only Labour that faced ruin. On the opposite benches, the Conservatives sat in a state of disbelief. For years, they had convinced themselves that Nigel Farage was a mere disruptor, and someone who could rally anger but never govern, a man to be mocked on television panels, as dismissed in private briefings and ignored when it came to serious matters of state. Yet here he was, commanding the chamber, commanding the Speaker's recognition and commanding the attention of millions across the country. Farage's strikes against them had been just as lethal as those he delivered to Labour. He had called out their failures on immigration, their empty economic promises, their years of stagnation disguised as leadership. "You let this country rot," he had said, and even the most hardened Tory MPs could not deny the sting of truth in those words. Their party's image of competence, of resilience, of continuity had been exposed as a hollow mask. And as the Speaker's words echoed in their ears, the Conservatives realised with growing dread that they too had lost their grip on power. The chamber had become a stage for the destruction of both major parties. Labour humiliated, Conservatives exposed, both pillars of the old order collapsing together. In their place stood Nigel Farage, not gloating, not shouting, but standing with the quiet certainty of a man who knew he had already won. He had turned silence into dominance, presence into power, and truth into a weapon sharper than any political tactic. Every MP, whether Labour or Conservative, now saw him differently. He was no longer the outsider. He was the reckoning. Beyond Parliament's walls, the country was already reacting. Social media surged with clips of Starmer's trembling collapse and Farage's devastating words. Hashtags trended across platforms within minutes. Millions of citizens who had long felt ignored by the politics now felt electrified, as though their frustrations had finally been spoken aloud on the grandest stage of all. In pubs, in cafes, in living rooms across the UK, people were glued to their screens, replaying every moment: the collapse of Starmer, the silence of Reeves, the discomfort of Tory MPs, the Speaker's declaration. It was a national spectacle that no one could look away from. Some reacted with joy, others with horror, but all understood that they were witnessing a turning point in history. Internationally, the shock was just as intense. News anchors in Washington, Paris, Berlin and Brussels reported live updates, their voices betraying disbelief. Diplomats scrambled to prepare reports for their governments, trying to explain how a man once dismissed as a fringe figure now stood as Britain's next Prime Minister. For years, world leaders had treated Farage as an irritant on the edges of politics. Now they were forced to reckon with him as the central figure of British power. What would this mean for trade, for alliances, for the European Union, for NATO? Uncertainty spread like wildfire across capitals as Britain's political earthquake rippled outward across the globe. Inside Parliament, the silence stretched on. MPs whispered, aides scribbled notes, journalists frantically typed updates, but all of it seemed small compared to the magnitude of what had just happened. Keir Starmer, once hailed as Labour's saviour, sat hollow, motionless, his authority drained away. Rishi Sunak's allies, though no longer in government, whispered nervously from the Tory benches, realising that their party too had been dragged into the wreckage. And in the middle of it all, Nigel Farage remained still, calm, collected. The one figure in the room who seemed unshaken by the chaos swirling around him. He had not just delivered a speech. He had staged a reckoning. He had dismantled reputations, destroyed illusions, and seized authority not by force, but by conviction. It was then that the true weight of the Speaker's declaration began to settle. Nigel Farage was not simply another voice in the chamber anymore. He was not an agitator shouting from the sidelines. He was now, in essence, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The implications were staggering. Britain had entered uncharted waters. The old certainties were gone. Labour was shattered. The Conservatives were stripped bare. The people, for the first time in decades, felt as though their anger had found a champion. And the rest of the world watched, stunned, as the foundations of British politics were rewritten in a single afternoon. The air in Westminster grew heavier with every passing moment, as if the chamber itself understood the magnitude of the shift that had just taken place. A government had not fallen through an election or a scandal. It had crumbled in plain sight, dismantled by words, silence, and the Speaker's declaration. The atmosphere was thick, almost suffocating. And even the grandeur of the Commons chamber seemed smaller under the weight of history. Members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispers replacing the usual roar of debate. For once, the House of Commons was not a battlefield of noise. It was a theatre of stunned silence.